Well, good evening and happy February 1st. It's great to be with you guys. And as always, it's just a pleasure to spend the evening with all of you. And I can't hardly believe it is February. I mean, it's the beginning of bee season, which is so much fun. It's such a blast to see bees starting to grow and build and take flight and breaking clusters. If you're in the southern half of the United States, you're getting some warmer days where bees are actually starting to come out and forage. If you're in the northern half of the United States, you're still kind of in the dead of winter and will be for a while. So sorry about that. But even if you're in the northern states, it's the beginning of bee season. So it's an exciting time in the bee world. Great to be sharing with you guys. If we haven't met before, my name is Blake. I'm one of the owners of the Bee Supply and a beekeeper, and have been a beekeeper for 20 years as a small scale beekeeper, and then a sideline beekeeper, and now a commercial beekeeper. And one of my favorite things to do is to educate other beekeepers. So very excited to be here with all of you guys this evening. And I'm going to share in a little bit some of the things that are going on in the world of beekeeping this time of year, specifically in California. So that'll be lots of fun. Great things to cover tonight. We've got Sherry, who is with us. She's going to do a presentation towards the end that will go over reversing boxes and boxes on hives this time of year. And then Dodie Stillman is with us this evening too. Thank you, Dodie. Dodie's manning the Q&A box tonight with Sherry. So appreciate both of them helping make tonight work. As we get rolling here, we still have some bees available. So if you haven't bought bees yet for this coming spring, everybody's running short. And so this is the time to get your orders in for spring pickup. I mentioned it in our last webinar, but I want to re-emphasize it again. And that is that we now offer a 30-day guarantee instead of a 14-day guarantee. So we really want to see you be successful in beekeeping. And if anything goes wrong in your first 30 days of beekeeping, we will replace your hive at no cost. So we really want you to succeed, and we think that's a pivotal piece of it. So we've got packages, nooks, and singles still available. And so I'd highly recommend you jump online and get those ordered if you haven't already. Okay, this is kind of a big deal, and I'll be honest, I was rushing around right before the webinar started trying to build out the PowerPoint, so forgive me, I don't have a big fancy picture or anything, but two really big announcements. One is that we are now shipping queens. So historically, you have to come into one of our stores and pick up queens. We are now shipping queens nationwide. So if you follow this QR code, that'll take you to our queen page on our website, and you can order queens from us and have them shipped straight to your door starting in the very early April. So we'd love to supply those of you that aren't local to one of our stores, and you can get queens from us now nationwide. We're also selling we're one of the first companies in the United States to do this. We're one of only a couple of companies that are selling the vaccinated queens. So you guys may have heard about these. They were all over the news over the past year that, hey, this company came out with this vaccine and they're giving this vaccine to queen bees, and it makes her and her brood and her offspring immune to American foulbrood. American foulbrood is one of the more dangerous foulbroods in the hive. It's more of a problem in the northern half of the United States and the southern half of the United States. And in the southern half, we don't see it too frequently, but I'm talking to a lot of beekeepers who are using these vaccinated queens and have done trial runs with them. And we're seeing we're seeing that the vaccine is helping with a lot of things, even beyond American foulbrood. That's anecdotal. I can't say that officially. But there's some research going on that's showing that it could be really, really interesting what this is actually doing in a lot of other health benefits to the queen and to the hive. So we have a whole webinar coming up just on this. It'll be, I think it's February 15th. We're sending an e-blast out tomorrow that you'll all get if you signed up for our e-blasts. And it'll give details about these queens, and then a special webinar that you can jump on and ask any questions that you have. We'll have the inventors of this vaccine on that webinar as well, and you can ask them all the questions that you'd like. So those are all available on the website. And we're calling it our Arrive Alive guarantee. One of the biggest challenges to shipping queens for you as a customer is sometimes the queens don't always make it alive. And we're guaranteeing that they will arrive alive, or we'll ship you a new queen. So check out the e-blast that will be in your inbox tomorrow. You can follow this QR code to our website and check out those shipping options for queens. We also have a big sale on global pollen patties. So if you want to get some pollen patties on your hives as they start coming out of winter, then we've got a really huge sale on the global pollen patties. I'll talk more about pollen patties later tonight and the kind of the pros and cons of should you use them this time of year or should you not. If you do opt to use them, take advantage of the sale. But I'm going to walk you through the pros and cons because I don't think that they're always necessary. In some situations, they're incredibly helpful. In some situations, not so much. And I'll kind of walk you through whether or not you should be using them for your bees. Last but not least, we've come out with a new program that if you want the bee supply to manage your beehives for you, follow this QR code. It's a new program we are trial running to see how it goes. But we have a lot of people that get discouraged in beekeeping or just want pollination benefits or don't want to manage their own hives or maybe want an ag exemption or maybe they're a hotel and want them on their rooftops. So we've launched a program that we will come manage your beehives for you if you want us to get involved and do that. So that QR code will take you to that option. Sherry, what do we have going on in the magazine this month?
Issue 44.
Amazing. Amazing.
It's like I fell asleep and woke up one day and we're like a long way to this, aren't we? So this month was packed full. Every day that clicks by, we're going to be stepping closer and closer into spring, just like Blake was talking about. And as you will see, the magazine will adapt and start heading that way with you. So we're going to be there. We're going to be following all of these things that are starting to take place in nature as we go. All the beekeepers go, yay, get out of winter, right? Get out of winter free card. So ready, y'all. I'm so ready. So as those start to change, so will the articles, like I said. So monitoring space and honey stores, that's a good one that's in this issue. Adding a second brood box to prevent early spring swarms. Golly, that's a good article because I'm going to tell you, if you have had that happen and you go, wait, we weren't spring yet. What are you doing? It will, it'll make you feel like you were just $1 late, day short, right? So read that article. It really gets you ahead. How and when to test for Verroa. I've already had a question on Q&A about that. Yes, y'all, it's getting time. A chat with the Mr. Fred Dunn. That was super cool. If you know who that is, he's a YouTube guy. And he's kind of smart. And he's been on YouTube, like, I'm not sure if he's the longest running, but almost either the second longest or the longest running. Super intelligent beekeeper. I loved the talk. Y'all log into that. It's on our YouTube channel too. And then here's some you don't expect. And I love this because I kind of wrote it myself, but I thought, well, does everybody know what a slatted rack is for? Well, let me just tell you. So go in and look and see what a slatted rack is for and see if it's something maybe you want to integrate in your beekeeping. And then Lynn Jones, our lovely Lynn Jones, did alternatives to painting hives. We all need that. And Blake wrote one, I love it. It's lighting a smoker and keeping it lit. Keeping it lit. All right, I'm ready for the spotlight. You can flip that slide, Blake. Anyway, lots of good articles. Well, the one I chose is actually written by Blake, but I love it. It's why are there dead bees and pupa in the front of my hive? This time of year, that is, to me, everything that is out of the ordinary concerns me. I'm sure that this far into my journey, I shouldn't let that happen, but it always makes me go, wait, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Are you supposed to do that? And if I don't know the answer, or I can't get it readily, then I do get concerned. So Blake goes into good detail to show you some things to look for. By the way, it's on page 16. First and foremost, we need to keep in mind our bees inherently are hygienic. So they're going to clean up the mess. So as winter progresses, we're going to have bees die, and they don't want the carnage inside there. It could get unhealthy for them, and they know it, and they clean it out. That isn't always the case for pupa, but sometimes they die in the cell, and they would clean those out. But more often than not, you're seeing just dead bees being raked out as they die because they're old. The nurse bees are old. The foragers, whoever went in last in the winter, they're starting to age out, and they're going to start dying off. So why are we seeing them? Could be a couple of reasons, and Blake goes into detail about starving, especially in the winter. And as we get to this stage of winter, where we're February through February, really start paying attention to your stores. One of those articles that's at the beginning of the magazine, because that is when end of February, 1st of March, very bad time for starvation. Varroa infestation could be that. That's kind of a sad thing. You'll start seeing things. He'll talk about that in that article. Pesticide poisoning. Hive that got too cold. Now, those of you that are really far north or just in areas that like to stay cold for a long, long time, the outer part of that cluster will, sometimes they'll get too cold and they'll just drop off, and somebody else will take their job in their place. And that might be some that they're pulling out. All of these are most evident if you live somewhere where you can see the dead in front of the hive, like snow. We don't have that. We were 70 degrees today. Can I get an amen? But some places it's more evident and it's a little more concerning, but it's just because you can see it. The rest of it's just, we can't even see it on the dirt or the grass or whatever. But anyway, go check it out. Page 16, Blake's article, but there's a lot in there. Y'all enjoy. I'll see you in a little while. So
Awesome. No, you're awesome, Sherry. Thank you. That was great. But it's a fantastic, fantastic magazine as always, but there's so much to talk about in February. If you want to take a class on spring splits, we've got a couple different options coming up in March to learn how to do spring splits. If you're not local to one of our stores, no problem. You can go onto our website and we have virtual split classes teaching you how to split bees virtually. So check that out. Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about what I've been up to in the bee world. And lately I've been in the state of California because it's the biggest pollination event in the world, pollinating the almond groves in the state of California. And so I was there yesterday and I took a video and did the bee yard portion of our video yesterday while I was in California and flew back home last night. So we're going to jump out to the bee yard. I'm going to look at some bees with you guys in California, and then I'm going to do kind of a drone flyover of one of our holding yards. Then we'll jump back in, and I'll tell you a little bit more about California and how it works, and then we'll get into our practical beekeeping tips for this evening. So hang in there just a second and let me share my screen and show you what is going on in California. Here we go. Oh, and I'm gonna apologize briefly in advance. One of these videos is a little bit choppy. I usually am able to get ahead of it and make sure the audio is awesome, but I've been up working bees most of the night and then running around checking bees all day, and forgot to screw in one of the audio cords are super tight, and so there's a little bit of static in one of them. So apologies in advance, but hopefully you'll still find it helpful. All right, here we go.
Hey friends, and happy February. It's hard to believe this is the 1st of February already, and bee season has begun. I am with you guys today filming from our location in California in the Central Valley, where I've got a few thousand beehives behind me. This is just a very temporary holding yard, and we've gotten a fair amount of rain, and so the bees get unloaded here just for a couple of days until they're ready. It's dry enough to get them into the almond orchards, which we're currently out here pollinating. So I've got a cool situation for you guys today because I have bees here from all over the United States that have shown up in the last couple of days, and we're going to take a look at them. And that hurt. we're going to take a look at them, and I'm going to let you know, we're going to take a look at what bees look like from a variety of places in the country. So we're going to look at some Florida bees and get a feel for what Florida bees look like right now, Texas bees, bees from Arkansas, a variety of states, and say, hey, at this point in the month of February, 1st of February, this is what bees look like from this state. And so it should be a cool experience to see what these hives are looking like. We'll look for eggs, larvae, and see what are February hives supposed to look like. So we'll jump right in and see what bees from all over the country look like right now. Okay, so these bees came out of Texas. So it's been, the last month has been pretty cold in Texas. We had some pretty severe cold spells. Now these bees are equally strong. And so the hive we just looked at had, probably 12 frames of bees in it. So 12 frames covered front and back with bees, which for almond pollination is amazing. I mean, it's no easy feat to even have 8 frames covered front and back with bees in January or the 1st of February. But, these hives are roughly equivalent in strength. So this hive we're going to look at, well, I say it is. I was judging it in front of the entrance. Nope, never mind. That one's not as strong. Let's find one that is equally as strong as what we were looking at before to get a good comparison. But I want to look at 2 hives that are kind of equivalent in bee population so that we can compare the brood. Here we go. Here's a good one. So this one's from Texas, equivalent bee population. Let's see what the brood looks like. Or let's see if they even have any brood at all. So Texas versus Florida. Okay, I've got some pollen left over from winter. And I have a frame of eggs. So you won't really be able to see the eggs, of course, but this frame is full of eggs. And when I see a frame like this, that you can tell around the edges, the bees are starting to drink the nectar around the edges, and you can see they're kind of leaving that center area open. When I see a frame like this in the brood nest, that often clues me into the fact that, hey, I think I have brood there. You can see the bees kind of down here on the left are clustering, drinking syrup because I smoked them, or nectar because I smoked them. But this whole center area, there's no bees, and it's because it's full of eggs. So this frame it's about half a frame full of eggs. On that frame anyway. Let's see what we find as we go a little bit further. Got this next frame has a few eggs on it. The next frame, no eggs at all. So no eggs other than that one frame in the bottom box. Let's march to the top and see if there's anything going on in the top box. The top box is very heavy, plenty of honey, a lot of great bees, so it's a very strong hive. A lot of honey in the second box. No need to feed it. If a hive this time of year has, 20, 30 pounds of honey in it, I'm not too worried. Ooh, so we got some brood up here. Okay, so check it out. It's not a huge patch of brood, but it's still not bad. We've got some good capped brood there. Some capped brood on this side. Plenty of honey. So beautiful band of capped honey. We've got some capped brood. Let's see how much we've got. So that's one. The next frame over, a beautiful frame of eggs. So this frame is just eggs. So you can see the bees are kind of leaving the space off in the middle, clustering around the edges. I've got just got some larvae getting ready to cap at the base of this frame, but largely just eggs. And looks like that's about it. Yeah, the rest of the top box is just honey. So equivalent bee population, but I've got 1 frame of capped brood and then 2 frames of eggs. And so it's amazing because on both hives had, 12, 13 frames of bees. So great bee population. The Florida guys, 8 frames of mostly capped brood and hatching brood. Texas, we've got 1 capped frame of brood and a couple frames of eggs, and that brood was just capped. So you can tell, the Florida bees are a solid month ahead of the Texas bees. So that certainly gives you a flavor of the difference that you'll see in bee strength across the country. Now, most of the country right now is going to be more in the Texas bee bucket or behind. Florida is certainly an outlier. Florida, Georgia, the Southeast is much earlier in brood production and brood rearing. When you get into the rest of the South, you're talking, maybe they might have a frame or 2, maybe 3 frames of brood. And then as you push north, more into the central US and further north, you probably will have, maybe a frame with a patch of eggs on it. As the days start getting longer, the queen will start laying, but you're not going to have a significant amount of brood. So in some areas, winter's almost over. We're coming out of winter in Texas. We're coming out of winter here in California. Florida's already out of winter. But for a lot of the US, you may still have a couple months left before you have a significant amount of brood. But it's pretty cool to see the differences in strength, or really brood production in various hives from all over the country. Hey guys, so let's see what Florida bees look like in early February. So these hives got here a couple nights ago into California, where I am right now, and we'll be putting these into almond orchards tonight. But let's see what bees that have come out of Florida look like in the 1st of February, which is what this is. I usually have my blue nitrile gloves on when I'm doing these videos. I've got some real gloves on. These are the new gloves we just came out with. They're ventilated, so they're nice and cool, but they're super, super bee proof. That's not because it's not because the Florida bees are mean, it's just because I'm actually doing real work today. And so when I'm actually doing a lot of real work and going through hundreds of beehives in a day, I usually opt for a little tougher glove than just a nitrile glove. So let's take a quick look at what's going on, and let's actually just jump down to the bottom box, because I want to see especially what kind of brood these hives have coming out of Florida. And that's one thing I'm always curious about, is to see what the difference is in brood coming out of one state versus a different state. So let's dig in. I've got a good healthy bee population. I've got probably 7 or 8 frames of bees in the bottom and 7 or 8 frames of bees in the top. Wow. Check it out. Absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's February. Look at that. Just a beautiful, beautiful frame of brood. We've got nice frame of honey around the edge, nice brim of honey around the edge. Here's even a drone. So we've even got a drone. Clearly they came out of Florida. You can see all the newly emerged bees. Look, here's a bee that just emerged out of her cell. So we've got all these hatching baby bees. Beautiful frame of brood that's already hatching out. And let's see how much of this they have. They've got, so 1 frame there. The opposite frame is full. 2, 3, 4. So they've got 5 frames of brood in the bottom box, which is awesome. I mean, it's February 1st. 5 frames of bees, 5 frames of brood. And those are solid frames of brood. Those aren't just little patches of brood. I mean, those are 5 solid frames of brood. And then here in the top box, let's see what's going on. So again, we've got lots of eggs, larvae, brood. So check this out. Beautiful frame of brood. You can see that you've got larvae around the edges. I don't know if you can see that or not, but see if I can get in a little closer. See that larva? beautiful larvae getting ready to be capped. And then on this side, look at all that drone brood. So you can see that how bumpy that drone brood is. So see, if you could tilt it down, you can kind of see how bumpy that drone brood is on the right. So it's a great shot of worker bee brood and some drone brood, and that's fine. I mean, usually you'll see the bees create a patch of drone brood on a frame. What you don't want to see is it mixed in sporadically with all your worker bee brood, but as long as they've kind of got it isolated to a section of a frame, that's pretty normal. You know, they want 10% of the brood to be drone brood. So it looks like I've got another 2 or 3 frames of brood in the top box. So, you know, 7 or 8 frames of brood in a hive out of Florida, February 1st. That's the beauty of beekeeping in Florida is, you know, you have such a warm winter that the bees can start brooding up. If they ever shut down at all, they can start brooding up, you know, early in February, and you can have strong pollen flows just way sooner. So Florida bees looking awesome. Let's take a look at some different bees and see what we find. So if you're new to beekeeping, or maybe you've been keeping bees for a long time, a common question is, how close together can I put my bees? And the bees get confused when they're trying to find their home. Normally I would do a video like this in our teaching bee yard with 4 or 5 hives in it, and kind of show you how to arrange things. But I want to take a second while I'm out here in our commercial holding yard in California, and you know, the 1st of February, and show you what bees are capable of and how well they can do in all sorts of conditions. So I've got a few thousand beehives behind me right now, and these have been unloaded in the last couple of nights, and they're only going to spend a couple of days here, and then they're going to go into the almond orchards to pollinate almonds. But you can see we've got each pallet of bees. There's 4 beehives on a pallet, and each hive is a couple inches apart on this pallet. And then you've got these rows of hundreds of hives, and each pallet is only 4, 5, 6 feet apart. And there is no drifting at all in this yard. I mean, what drifting is when, you know, the bees get confused about where they belong, and a bunch of the bees will kind of form a mass, drift on the hive, and you see this hive completely covered in bees. And that's when I go, uh-oh, we've got a problem. These bees are drifting. But, you know, that's a primary objective that we're trying to avoid when you arrange a bee yard. We don't want the bees to get confused. But even in this scenario where we have hundreds of hives in perfect lines, they are still doing a fantastic job at finding out which home is theirs and which hive is theirs. You notice a lot of these hives are different colors. So you might have a gray box and a white box, a mix of different colors. That does really help bees. In our operation, we try to have a mix of colors. Now, it doesn't have to be red and blue and green and orange and yellow, but like we have a lot of gray boxes, and then a lot of boxes, and then a lot of tan boxes, and we mix all those together, and that can help in these situations, help the bees find their way home. But even without that, the bees often do a really good job. So if you're trying to decide how to lay out your bee yard, what hive goes where, what I always tell beekeepers is do what's comfortable for you. So create enough space so that you can get all the way around each hive and work it properly. Put it at a height that's comfortable for you. Arrange it in a way that you like and is aesthetically pleasing for your backyard or your bee yard. And don't worry too much about the bees. If you've got 4 or 5 or 6 hives, they're going to do just a fine job finding their way home. You can sit on the front of the hive and that helps, or you can put them along a tree row and that helps. But if you have a few hives, you can put them in pretty much any configuration you want at any spacing that you want, and they'll be just fine. Now, one thing I would note, I would not leave these bees here, you know, for weeks on end throughout the spring or the summer this close together. We would space them out along a tree row, etc. But for a few days, they do just fine, and they orient just fine, even in mass quantities.
Okay, so let's turn down the music. But so that was a quick little overview of some stuff going on in California. And then I wanted to show you guys this video just real quick So this is one of our holding yards in California. And so this is drone footage. This was back in the winter time. So in the winter months, we're able to put thousands of beehives in one location or two locations in California. And it works great because the bees don't fly. You know, it's cool in most cases. And so the bees aren't really out foraging. They're just kind of clustered in their hives. And so because they're not out foraging and they don't need pollen, or they have plenty of food in their hive, you can just put mass quantities of bees here. And then once it starts warming up, we take those bees and we can move them into the almond orchards right before the bloom starts, and then they'll start pollinating the almond tree. So we just have these huge yards with 10 to 15,000 hives in them. And this time of year, our crew is actually going through every single hive. And so they're going through every hive, checking it, seeing if it needs food or treatment or pollen patties, etc., making sure it's healthy, pulling out any dead ones. And then those hives will go into the almond orchards for pollination. So it's a lot of work, and but it's a lot of fun. And we've got an incredible crew that does an incredible job working out there. This is just the foothills that shows you. I love this picture because I'm kind of standing up in the foothills, and you can look out on the Central Valley, and you can't really see it in this picture, but way in the distance, there's snow-capped mountains. And so it just really illustrates you're in this valley, and you can see the almond orchards out in the distance there. And it's just a beautiful valley with producing more food than anywhere else in the entire world. So it's pretty cool. This is a different holding yard of ours. I'm standing up in the foothills, just taking a picture, looking down at the holding yard. And that's us starting to work the bees. And so we usually start around the 1st of January, working the bees. And then by late January, we're done doing bee work, and all the bees are being moved into the almonds. And almonds, in my experience, are really the best thing you could do for bees. I mean, the almond pollen is one of the most nutritious brood building pollens in existence. And we work with growers that are incredibly careful and make sure the bees aren't sprayed, or there's not spraying going on when the bees are there. And so in our experience, the bees that are on almonds are 2 or 3 times better than bees that didn't go to almonds, because that pollen is so nutritious. It's warm. The bees grow faster. It's just a great kickstart for them before they are on to their next adventure somewhere else in the year. So other times for bees that didn't spend the winter in California, beekeepers will ship them to us, or we'll ship the rest of our bees to California, where they arrive on these semi trucks with nets on them. And so we take the nets off the semi trucks, we check the bees and make sure that they're full of bees. The average almond grower is looking for an average of 8 frames of bees. So that would be 8 frames covered front and back, mostly covered front and back with bees. These hives would be like 16 frames of bees, which is incredibly hard to achieve that time of year. Most of the time, you're just at 8 frames, which is one deep box, mostly full of bees. This was last year, actually, but the bees were kind of mean last year. This was like the first day that they were really able to fly. They hadn't flown in like a month, and then we had a warm day and they started flying. And it happened to be the day that we were actually working them. And so it was a bad combination. They hadn't got up out and stretched their wings in a very long time. And then we're up there opening up their boxes. And so for like 2 days, the bees were just crazy mean. And then they settled down and were perfectly gentle. But there were so many bees, you would just wipe your bee veil to be able to see. You had to wipe your veil to get them out of the way to see. And they were super creative because we were, of course, all wearing super suits, so they couldn't sting us. But they would stick their stinger through the veil, and you'd see these little droplets of venom come to the end of their stinger, and then they would fan their wings and they would blow that venom into your face. And so all day long, our eyes were running, our lips were swollen. If you licked your lips, you could taste the venom. And they were just blowing this venom in our face all day. It was so weird. And then a couple days went by, and they stopped. So weird experience. This is just us unloading bees in the evening. And so usually the trucks roll in the evening. We unload them, get them ready to go into the orchards. There's also some of our trucks, transferring the hives onto our flatbed trucks. And then there's another picture of one of our trucks. And then we transport them into the orchards. The growers give us maps that show us where the bees go. So we have these maps that we're looking at to guide us where to put the bees at night. And then we put them usually in drops of 8 to 16 hives per drop, and then several drops throughout the orchard to pollinate the almonds. This is we don't usually flip over forklifts, but it does happen on occasion, especially on ridiculously muddy years. When it's muddy and wet out there, everything is just 10 times harder, like it was last year and like it is this year. Just so wet and so muddy. This was one of our guys that was unloading a forklift off a trailer at night and didn't see the ditch, and actually flipped the forklift over. And thankfully, he was perfectly fine, perfectly safe. But it was not a good experience that we try really hard not to replicate. But it's always an adventure out there, and so thankful for the crew that we have that just go above and beyond to safely get bees into orchards. So, okay, so let's dive into practical beekeeping. What about your bees? What's going on with your beehives? This time of year, it's such a roller coaster. I mean, in some areas, you've got a tremendous pollen flow. In some areas, you still have several feet of snow, and everywhere in between. So this was the February through April temperature outlook for 2023. So this was from our February webinar, monthly buzz webinar in 2023. I showed this picture. And it kind of showed, and it was pretty accurate, actually. It ended up being a pretty early warm spring across much of the south, and then a pretty cold spring in much of the north. So this is the map that was just released for 2024. So this year, not that dissimilar, except in north, they're predicting a much warmer February through April. So pretty warm across the south, but really warm everywhere except for far southeast coast. And let's face it, you guys in the southeast, I mean, you've had you always get the warm weather, so you'll probably be glad to get some cooler weather. But really, the blue is near average. So they're actually predicting an average spring for the southeast, and then everywhere else, we're looking at much warmer than normal. So that has implications for you as beekeepers. Assuming this holds true, it means that flowers are going to start blooming earlier, bees are going to start swarming earlier. You're going to need to, make sure you're watching for swarm issues. We'll talk about that a lot more in March, but it's something to be aware of. Your bees may eat more food when it's a warmer spring. February 2021 was also a very warm spring, and then this was Texas in February of 2022. It was super cold, super snowy, and so pay attention to the weather because it can change super rapidly. Southern half of the United States, you're starting to see some blooms. You're starting to see some dandelions, some henbits, some mustards, or just maybe barely starting to bloom. Elms and willows will start soon, and it looks like it's going to stay pretty warm for the foreseeable future. So if you're in the southern half of the United States, expect to start seeing a trickle of a pollen flow pretty soon. Northern half, it'll be a minute, but it's coming. This is a map that we put together here at TBS, and this is by no means perfect, but it's an average representation of when your major pollen flow starts. Now, this isn't so much of when you might see a trickle of pollen. You might see a bee here or there coming in with pollen earlier than this, but on average, this is when like a significant pollen flow begins, where your bees are bringing in significant amounts of pollen and kind of don't stop from there on out. So yeah, you can screenshot this map or come back and look at the recording, take a picture of it. But this is when in general you can expect to see a major pollen flow. And again, that has implications. Once that pollen flow really kicks in, your bees are going to start growing rapidly. They're going to start eating food rapidly. You can start thinking about ordering queens to make splits. Usually in most areas, 4 to 6 weeks after your major pollen flow begins is kind of the classic time to start making splits. So current conditions, again, all over the place, but it varies. Brood rearing is ramping up. We saw in the video there's a big difference in Texas versus Florida, for example. Up north, you might have in the northern half of the United States, you may just have a patch of eggs, and that's it. But because days are getting longer, the queen is going to start laying, even if it's not a lot. And then we just start this pollen roller coaster where you get a great pollen flow, and then it gets cold for a week, and the bees stop flying, and you kind of see this roller coaster for the first month of spring or so. This is a super sad picture, but it's a reality. This is something that is not uncommon to see this time of year. It's a hive that just was not able to keep themselves warm. And you can see in this picture, and there's actually the queen. She has a yellow mark on her back, and these bees are dead, unfortunately. And when you see just this tiny little cluster, they weren't able to keep themselves warm on cold nights. You can see this hive also doesn't have much food, so that's not helping anything. But they did start rearing brood. You can see that capped brood there that they started rearing, but then they just didn't have the bee population to keep themselves warm on those really cold nights. When this happens, it's so sad, but super common. You can just brush those dead bees off and then reuse this hive to start, put a package in this equipment or put a nook in this equipment. And it's a great way to restart your hive next year. But seeing this is a pretty classic sign of them not able to keep themselves warm. If you see this on a large scale, it means they probably starved to death. If you see this on several frames covered with bees and they're all dead, but not much stored honey, then they probably starved to death, unfortunately. So yeah, inside February hives, it can run the gamut, and you saw that in the video. You can have 8 frames of brood if you're from Florida, a frame and a half if you're from Texas, a little patch of eggs if you're further north. So it's probably more varied this time of year than any other time of year. You see this ridiculous variation. Once we get to May, June, July, August, all beehives kind of level out. We see about the same amount of brood throughout the country, but this time of year, it's wild fluctuations. You're going to see some cleansing flights and orientation flights. That's pretty common. Once you get a warm day and the bees haven't flown much, you're going to see them flying a lot. You're going to see this burst of activity on warm days, and they are going to be going to the restroom because they've been cooped up in the hive for a long time, or they're going to be orienting as new brood emerges, and they're going to be doing those orientation flights. It's pretty uncommon to see a swarm this time of year. If you're in Florida, maybe you might see a swarm in February. Most of the rest of the U.S., you're not really going to see swarms. Usually that burst of activity is one of these two things. So feeding, your goal this time of year is really to maintain at least 20 pounds of honey on your hive through the month of February. And in some areas that will be achievable just by maybe feeding once or not needing to feed at all. In other areas, you might need to feed constantly. If you're in the southern US and your bees are growing quickly, you might need to feed 2 or 3 times to maintain that 20 pounds. I would switch to 1-to-1 syrup feeding in the month of February. If you're in the South and your bees need food, I would go ahead and start switching to that probably mid-February, the 1-to-1 feeding. If you're further north and your bees need food, you're probably still limited to sugar bricks or some feed source directly on top of the hive for the next month or so. I do recommend using division board feeders rather than entrance feeders or top feeders, or use Ziploc bag method, which we talked about in our November webinar, or use a sugar brick because the bees are going to have a hard time getting down to the entrance feeder or up to a top feeder when it's really cold. And then I would check 2 or 3 times through the month of February to make sure they have enough food. This time of year is tricky because as the bees are growing crazy fast, they can really eat a lot of food when you're not expecting them to. So I mentioned this earlier that we would talk about pollen patties, and are pollen patties necessary? Are they helpful? Should you feed pollen patties in February? I would say that when it's important to feed, and I would say I highly recommend it, is if you have cold snaps. So if you're after brood rearing has begun and your bees are rearing brood, they bring in some pollen, and then you have a cold week to 10 days and the bees can't fly, it doesn't hurt to throw a pollen patty on there, because now they have all this brood being reared, and now suddenly no pollen coming in, and they can start cannibalizing that brood if they run out of food to feed it. So throwing a pollen patty on there on those cold spells once brood rearing has begun can really help them just keep the brood production going. Now, it's not a bad idea to feed proactively. Again, it's not critical. I'm not trying to make a sales pitch here. It's not like your hive is going to die if you don't feed them pollen substitute this time of year. However, for my thousands of hives where I'm spending a fortune on pollen substitute, I do feed pollen substitute this time of year. We just had, several pallets of it delivered out in California, and we're putting pollen patties on everything. I feel like it's a good return on investment. Again, it's not going to be life or death for your hives. But what I find that it does is, as that queen is starting to first rear brood, that pollen patty in there just helps her continue rearing brood consistently. Without that pollen substitute, you kind of get these starts and stops, and now it's cold, and now I'm not foraging, so shut down brood rearing. It just helps kickstart them in the brood rearing mode. If you're planning on splitting your bees this year, or growing your bee numbers, I would certainly recommend feeding pollen substitute. If your bees look healthy and you've got great boxes full of bees and you don't really want to make a whole bunch of splits, I probably wouldn't bother. Sherry mentioned Verroa mites, and I hate talking about it because it's discouraging, and none of us like talking about Varroa mites. But it is a reality that we have to think about this time of year. They are, anytime brood rearing is occurring, Varroa mites are reproducing. So this is the month, if you're in the southern half of the United States, I would say for most areas of the South, mid to late February, it's time to do a Varroa mite test. And you can use a sticky board, you can do the CO2 test, you can do an alcohol wash, whatever method you use. I would do a test in late February, and you may not need to treat at all. A lot of hives do not have high mite levels in late February, but if you do, the month of March is really the month to get a treatment on to get those mite levels down before you have to start thinking about withdrawal periods before you put your honey supers on. So March and April, good months to do a mite treatment. If they need it, start monitoring in February. If you do a test in late February and maybe another one in late March, and your hives don't have mites over 2 per 100 bees, you probably don't have to worry about a treatment until summer. But if you're at 3, 4, 5 mites in February or March, unfortunately, you're going to need to do a treatment. And I just put a little note down here on the bottom that if you just have a couple frames of brood, 1, 2, 3, you can use Hop Guard, oxalic acid, formic acid, more natural treatments. If you have multiple frames of brood and you have high mite levels, you're probably going to need to use something like Apibar or Apigard to really knock those high mite levels down. Oh, here's what I mentioned earlier, which was just the seasonal threat. As that population increases and grows, you're going to have an ever increasing threat of Varroa mite. So you can see down here in February and March, it's pretty low, but it's starting to ramp up with bee population. So sticky boards, I like talking about sticky boards because I feel like, so sticky boards are not the most accurate way to test for Varroa mites. They're just not. They're not the most effective way to test is alcohol washes. But alcohol washes do 2 things. They kill bees, and a lot of people don't like that. It doesn't really hurt your hive, but a lot of people don't want to kill the bees. But then secondarily, the alcohol wash is just kind of a pain to do, and it's difficult to do. And so a lot of people don't do it because it's a pain. And so I'd like to talk about sticky boards because they don't kill bees. It's easy to do, and it has a much higher likelihood of people actually doing it. And so sticky boards are better than nothing. All you have to do, literally all you have to do, get a sticky board from us, slide it underneath the hive or in the entrance of the hive, wait 24 hours, pull it back out, count the Varroa mites. If you have more than 9, in that 24-hour period in the spring, means you need to do a treatment. If you have more than 11 in the summer, you need to do a treatment. That's it. Super simple. Don't inspect the hive when the sticky board is on it, because it jars loose a lot of the Varroa mites, and you can get an artificially high Varroa mite drop. But yeah, super simple, decently accurate to give you a good general feel for what your mite levels are. Okay, so overcrowding in February. I hope this is a problem that you do have, because it means that you've got a really, really healthy hive. But it's not uncommon to have a hive that is so strong and so good that you're worried about it overcrowding early in the month. Now, you know, for you guys further north, you know, this, I would say you could call this overcrowding in March. You know, you're a month oftentimes from the bees really growing and worrying about overcrowding. But in general, it's a good problem. When the top box becomes 80% full of bees, and I'm assuming your bottom box is 80% full too. Sherry's going to talk about that later. It's not uncommon to have the top box 80% full of bees and the bottom box completely empty. And Sherry's going to talk about, hey, you don't need to add another box. You just need to reverse the boxes, because bees like to move up. But Sherry's going to talk about that in a minute. But if the bottom box is full and that top box is 80% full, you need to do something to prevent swarming. I mentioned, remember those hives we were looking at in California in the video earlier, those hives were getting really full. You know, they were, bottom box is pretty much full, top box was pretty much full. So if this is you, you've got three options. You can make a split, reduce the strength of that hive so they don't swarm. You can add boxes, or you can equalize. So those are kind of your three options to prevent swarming if they're really full. So the first one, February splits, I don't really recommend it. It's hard to find queens. They're virtually unavailable. You can get them from Hawaii. I'm not always a big fan of Hawaii queens, quality wise, and this early in the season. You can experiment, try them out, see if they work for you, but not a huge fan. But queens are unavailable in the rest of the US. Allowing the bees to raise their own queen is slow, and it's really risky this early in the year because there's not enough drones many times to properly mate with the queens. And then with so many cold snaps, the queen isn't guaranteed to mate well. And so the exception, I would say, is if your hive already has swarm cells, so if they're so full that they already have swarm cells, really, in my opinion, the only way to stop a hive from swarming once it has swarm cells is to make a split. You can try wiping out the queen cells. Odds are you're going to miss one. Sometimes a hive will swarm anyway, even if you wipe out the queen cells. So if you've got queen cells everywhere and it's a really strong hive, yeah, go ahead and make a split and hope for the best that that queen that they raise will mate properly. Again, we'll talk way more about splitting and swarming in March, but a little sneak peek for you. My recommendation is add a box. When the top box or super is 80% full, add another box. You can add my favorite thing to do if I have a hive that's that strong is add a box of foundation and do light 1-to-1 syrup feeding, and they'll draw it out. So you can get them to draw extra comb for you. And then that box should hold them over until queens become available in most places in early April. So that's what I recommend to do if it's full. I also recommend, if you don't want to add a box, is you can equalize. You can share brood bees and honey between hives. Here's a prerequisite though, before you share brood between hives. Number one, make sure your mite levels are low. You don't want to spread a bunch of mites to different hives. No brood disease, so make sure your brood bees, and if you're sharing brood bees or honey, you need to have no brood disease. So you want to watch for larvae that look abnormal. So if you could see it in the video, the larva we showed was like pearly white and shiny. What I watch out for is larvae that looks shriveled or yellow or melted. And if you're seeing a lot of that, you don't want to share that brood with other hives. Make sure you leave the original donor hive at least one box full of bees this time of year. So don't take so many resources that you weaken them too much. And then gauge a hive strength on a warm day over 60 degrees. If it's colder than that, you're going to have a hard time seeing how full that hive actually is. So if you're equalizing brood between hives, it's really simple. And we've got a great YouTube video. If you go to our YouTube channel and just search, I don't know, equalizing or brood, it'll pop up. It's really simple. You're going to select a frame of mostly cat brood. And I like to do cat brood because if I give a weaker hive a frame of larva, it's a lot of work that they have to do to take care of that larva. So my super duper strong hive, I'm going to get a frame of cat brood out of it. I'm going to shake off the bees, add the frame to the center of the brood nest on a weaker hive between other frames of brood. I usually only add one frame because I want to make sure that that weaker hive has enough bees to fully cover the new frame of brood. And then you can replace that frame you pulled out of the weaker hive into the original hive on the outside edge. So when you pull that frame of brood out of the middle of the stronger hive, you don't want to put an empty frame right back in the middle because that breaks up the brood nest, and we never want to do that. We want to keep brood together. So that frame, that replacement frame, you just put it on the outside edge of the hive. You can equalize honey too. If you have a hive with a ton of extra honey, you can take a frame of honey, shake the bees off, and out it to the outside edge of the cluster or brood area on a hive that does need the honey. You never want to put a frame of honey between frames of brood because you want to keep that brood together. But you can certainly trade honey between hives if you have one that needs it. Lastly, you can equalize bees. This is a little more challenging to do, but if you have a hive that doesn't have enough bees, you can give them some bees by getting a frame of bees out of your really strong hive. Ideally, select a frame that is covered in larvae, because that means that the bees on that frame are nurse bees and they integrate into a new hive seamlessly. There's no fighting. And make sure the queen isn't on the frame. Smoke the entrance of your weaker hive. Bake the bees off the frame into the entrance of the weaker hive. And all those worker bees will just crawl right into the weaker hive and integrate seamlessly into their new society. You can repeat that with up to 3 frames of bees. Don't take too much from the original hive, but you can add a lot of bees, and then you can add brood too. So you can add brood and bees, and that really, really makes a big difference in obviously boosting up the strength of a weaker hive and in reducing the strength of that stronger hive that you're worried about swarming. I'm going to skip that real quick. Okay, so Sherry, your turn. Sherry is going to talk about reversing boxes, which is a super important thing this time of year. And I will let you take it from here. I think you're going to share your screen, right?
I am.
Okay. All right, go for it.
Okay. But you know what? My partner's not with me. James isn't here. He's here, but he, to those who don't know, James had back surgery Friday. So y'all know what his world has been like, and mine. Let me just say, bless his heart. And I mean it from the bottom of my heart. He has had a tough time. The doctor said it was just nearly as bad as he's ever seen. So we'd love for everybody to put him in your prayers. He is doing better, but he doesn't need to be sitting down here typing or talking. So, okay, we're going to talk about reversing or rotating brood boxes. Now, this is also in the magazine this month. Happens to be that James wrote that article. And it's a great article about it, and it details it about as much as I'm going to do here. But anyway, you can go and read the Word version in this month's issue. There's a theory behind rotating or reversing boxes, because like Blake's talked about, as winter goes along, you know, as we're prepping for winter, we want to pack on the honey, right? We want them to have stored honey, and it's above them, around them, everywhere in the box that we can get them to pack it away so that they'll survive. Well, as winter occurs, the box of bees starts to eat through those stores and migrates up. And this theory is that we're going to kind of play Mother Nature a little bit and do a swap in order for them to have space and not swarm early. Well, I didn't tell you the end of the story, but that's the theory behind this. So let's move on. So there's a time and a place for everything, right? Well, reversing brood boxes kind of falls into that category because first of all, I'm going to say not everybody does it. So you kind of got that out, but different locations and different weather patterns can depict whether or not you do that. So if we're consistently cold, so if you live up north and you're nothing but under snow, the duration, 6 months or 7 months or whatever it is, then your bees are going to consume less stores. And yes, they'll migrate up eating through them, but it'll be at a slower rate because conversely, on that right-hand side, cold one day, warm the next, which is what we are. Our bees are constantly going, oh, it's winter. Nope, wait, oh, it's spring. Nope, wait, they don't know what to do. So one day they're foraging, the next day they're hiding and clustering. We had a cold snap, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was cold. It was very cold for a solid week, 6, 7 days. And our bees were clustered hard, very clustered. So they didn't do much consumption. They're there, they're shivering. They're not reaching out for a lot of stores because they're not working off the stores built up in their body that they need to replenish, right? But now that's passed. That was that one little small window. Now today we had a cleansing flight. I commented that in the chat box when Blake was talking about that. Warm days, they're out. They're either their cleansing flight or their orientation flight. And this may happen off and on for the next several weeks. Actually, it's been happening. We had a cleansing flight last week too, still in January. So this can kind of give you an idea of whether or not reversing is even going to be in your wheelhouse. The one on the right, very well may be. The one on the left, maybe not. It may not be necessary. So let's move on. I did talk about theory. Most of the winter honey stores above the brood nest, and as they're consumed, the entire cluster, you can picture that, right? As heat rises, they're going to rise with it as they eat through their stores. And there they go up to the top. As a result, they'll be primarily inhabiting the top box. That may not be a good thing as the season progresses, as spring gets closer. If the queen, as she starts laying, fails to move downward to access the open brood frames, because obviously they've deserted it for egg laying, then they're going to feel like they're constricted to that top box and not utilize the space that's there for them in the bottom. So that's the theory behind it. We're supposed to, as beekeepers, we're thinking for our bees, right? We know better, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. So this is, I made this a couple of years ago. It shows you as if it's a double deep. Now, those that are in a single deep, obviously this does not apply. But if you're in a single deep, as winter goes in, your bees should take up both the center portion, remember it's like a football, of the top box and the bottom box. But as winter progresses and the cluster gets tighter, plus we're losing bees, so we are losing population, the cluster gets smaller and they're tighter, but then they're going to consume those resources and migrate themselves up. It's just logical. Doesn't always happen. Depends on how bad the winter is. It depends on the size of the colony. Depends on a lot of factors. But you can see where we're going with this theory. Kind of migrating up, aren't we? All right. So your goal. I love this picture. I can't take credit for it. Paul Longwell in 2015. I found this on the internet and I've used it 1,000 times. It shows you the right and the wrong, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. But reversing can work as long as you think it through. You want to move the brood nest to the lowest position because bees in the Langstroth hive tend to build up. So if you have your bees all in the top box and you reverse them, then you've just given them like adding a whole new box because all that's drawn out, right? All that comb is already drawn out. May still be some resources off on frames 1 and 10 or 2 and 8. There may still be some resources there that they'll utilize once they migrate back up because it'll be warmer weather and they're spreading out, being able to venture off to it. But what you don't do is what you see on that bottom drawing. If that is still in the center, like that center picture on the last frame and in this one here, if you split that, what have you done? You've split the brood nest. And yes, they will eventually kind of join back together, but depending on what the weather is, what if we did this right before a cold snap? We've all of a sudden, we've taken their resources away from them. That top box on the bottom right, they're just up there hanging in suspension going, I've got no food. I'm up here by myself. I can't keep warm. What did you do? It could be detrimental. So really and truly pay attention to whether or not that brood nest has moved all the way up. If it's a little bit on the, just at the top bars of that bottom box, you're okay to do it. But really, if it's not moved all the way up, it's just really not worth taking a chance that you could subject them to not being able to thermoregulate their box, which we know is super important, especially this time of year. I love this picture. Saw it years and years ago. Our friend Randy Oliver, scientificbeekeeping.com. It shows a winter cluster literally split open. So he's in Northern California. So I was really surprised to see this when I found it all those years ago. But that is a cluster right there, split in half. Now, if we were to take that and pull them apart and reverse them, that's that top picture on that last slide, right? This would have been terrible. It's both, that's spanning both boxes. And if you, that would be doing it too early. That'd be taking the cart before the horse. They would probably all just move back up. And I think the theory, and I read a really good long article about that once, that if you do it too early, then it's for naught, because they are just all going to just collectively be where they were, get right back where they were, move right back up, and you're just going to be right where you started, and it was for nothing. It was for nothing, but that's all right. $1 million question. Of course, this is going too fast. Am I talking? It's because James isn't here, right? So the $1 million question is, do you need to do this? Is this necessary for you to do? Well, yes and no. Don't you love that answer? Yes and no. You don't have to. The bees will probably manage one way or the other. There's a lot of articles and people. We did this presentation at a conference in North Texas a couple of weeks ago, and there was very strong opinions on whether or not you reverse brood boxes or not. Some people are adamantly for it, and some people are adamantly against it. I can tell you that we will reverse some, and we will not reverse others, but I believe in it. And you can take that for what it's worth, but you can look at it and decide for yourself. You do have options though. It is optional, but your options can go off into just waiting it out. Monitor your space in the food stores closely. If they've all migrated up and they're managing to keep warm and everything's fine, because think about it, if they're not holding both boxes, that bottom box temperature, especially in colder zones, can kind of get to be where it's like an ice box sitting underneath them when they really want a heating pad. So really pay attention to that. The size of the cluster, the size of the colony, that can be your option there. You can do it or not do it based on that. Be prepared to feed, especially if you don't reverse those boxes. If there's no food up there, if they've eaten through that food stores up top, then they're going to be that starvation bee that Blake was talking about a minute ago. That to me is the most heartbreaking event ever. I can say that we've never had that personally happen, but I've seen it and it's terrible. We were always probably in the beginning overkeepers. So we probably fed too much. We were that one that you were talking to, that the instructors were talking to, that said you need to back off. You're backfilling the brood nest and all that. But I was so afraid of that starvation. And maybe that was good. I don't know. There needs to be a happy medium there. But be prepared to feed, because if you don't reverse, then that bottom box is empty. There's no really anywhere for them to go. and really, we're the ones that are responsible, right? We're the beekeepers. Reversing's done before nectar flow. If you've not done it before the nectar flow and it starts early even in your area, just abandon it, because they're going to come back in. They're going to make it for the loss. They will migrate to the bottom, take up the space, and work it and be perfectly okay with it. Swarm preventative, that is why we do it. I can tell you that is the only reason we do it, because we are in such a warm climate. Our swarm season starts before anything else is going on. It's like the elm trees have just barely sprouted, and our bees are going, well, let's see if we can play havoc on our beekeeper. We're going to see if we can't get a swarm out of here before there's even hardly a drone to be had. And they will. And in order for us to prevent that, we like to reverse, because it just adds another box on top, and it happens to be theirs. So, take that for what it's worth, whether you want to do it or not. It's your decision. It's up to you. Well, I hope that was okay. And rejoice in your accomplishment.
That was great. That's exactly what we needed to hear as beekeepers this time of year. So thank you. That was fantastic. Okay, so let me jump back into my PowerPoint here. And here we go. I did want to touch on one quick thing, and then we might have some time to do some live Q&A. So if we have a few minutes left here, we can do some live Q&A and answer some of your questions. But so when you're looking through your hives in the month of February, what should you be looking for? What am I looking for when I'm going through bees in February? The frames of brood is all over the place. It could be 2 to 8 frames of brood, but I'm starting to watch for pollen stores, especially if my hive is rearing brood. If there's no brood in the hive, in any of my hives, because it's too cold, I don't really expect to see pollen. But once they start rearing brood, then I start expecting to see some pollen stores. If I see a lot of brood in my hive, and this is not uncommon to see in the spring, if I see a lot of brood in my hive and like almost no pollen anywhere, that's when I step in and give them a pollen patty, because they can outgrow the local forage that time of year. It could be that, the queen started ramping up and there's not enough forage, and then you have a problematic ratio of brood to pollen stores. So I want to see abundant and growing pollen stores. 9 times out of 10, the bees do a great job of regulating this on their own. I'm looking for at least 20 pounds of stored honey in the second box. I'm looking for an actively laying queen. I said in here, the notes, no eggs or larvae equals no queen. As we progress later and later into February, that becomes increasingly true. But I think that the best thing to do is to compare each hive to other hives. If you have one hive that has no eggs or larvae, and it has an equivalent bee population as the hive next door, and the other one has, 2 or 3 frames of brood eggs and larvae, the first one's probably queenless. If you go through all your beehives and none of them have eggs or larvae, yeah, it's just too early. They just haven't started rearing yet. But when I see that outlier that doesn't have eggs this time of year or larvae, that's when I get concerned. And you can see that occasionally. And in those cases, I usually give it another week and make sure that, a week later, they still don't have eggs and larvae. That's usually when I would just combine that hive with another hive. You could give them a frame of eggs and larvae and let them raise their own. Again, you just never quite know if it's going to survive or be a healthy, productive queen because of the mating uncertainty this time of year. But it doesn't hurt to give them a frame of eggs and larvae and see if they'll make it. So that's kind of what I'm doing as I'm working through the hives this time of year. So real quick, as we've got a few minutes left, and so let's take a few questions. So I'm going to pull open the Q&A box. Some of you guys have already added some questions in here for me, so thank you. And let's just answer a few questions in the few minutes we have left. This is always fun. Somebody said, have you ever seen a double deep in Texas not move up in the winter? So it's a great question. And it's rare. I mean, usually in most states, Texas or others, typically the bees are going to move up through the course of the winter. The time I see that not occurring is if the top box is mostly empty and doesn't have much honey in it, and all your honey stores are in the bottom box, which isn't normal, but occasionally can happen. Then the bees tend to stay where the food is. In most cases, bees over the fall stored all that honey or syrup in the upper box, and then the bees move up to where the honey is over the course of the winter. So the vast majority of the time, yeah, 2/3 of your bees are going to be up in that second box, and in February you can reverse it just like Sherry described. Let's see. What is a good time to switch boxes in Texas? Spring, early spring. I'm assuming you're talking about rotating boxes. If you mean rotating boxes, I usually do the rotation once daytime temperatures are consistently in the 60s. So, that's going to vary tremendously depending on where you are in the country. But once daytime temperatures are consistently in the 60s, that's usually when I reverse boxes. If you meant swap out equipment, like you've got an old box that's falling apart and you want to swap it out with a new box, again, once daytime temperatures are really in the 50s, you can swap out equipment. Let's see, Nancy, you said you were making sugar bricks and the oven got too hot. Some sugar melted, but not all. Can you still feed it to the bees? So if you cook sugar and it turns into uh, like a hard candy, like if you melt the sugar and it's like a candy, then you really shouldn't feed it to the bees because it's going to be too hard for them to consume. They need a softer sugar to consume. So yeah, if it's really hard like candy, no, you can't really feed it to them. If it's not hard, if it's still crumbly enough to where you can crumble it, then sure, it's fine to feed it to them. Kenny asked a good question. Do y'all have comments on Amiflex, this new mite treatment? Yeah, I mean the testing I've done on it is pretty awesome. I mean, so the Amiflex is very similar to Apivar. They both have Amitraz. Sorry, all the A's here. Amitraz is the active ingredient in Amiflex and Apivar. Apivar is the plastic strip that you put into the hive, and it's a slow release. That the plastic strip does a slow release of Amitraz over a period of weeks and slowly kills the Verroa mites as they hatch out of the brood. Amiflex is more of a gel that you put in the hive, and it's what we call a flash kill. And so it kills mites very quickly, but it doesn't stay in the hive very long. So with Amiflex, you're doing a couple of treatments. Flash treatments to kill mites quickly. In my experience, if you have high mite levels, then Amiflex works really well. So if you're at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 mites per 100 bees and you need to kill mites quickly, then the Amiflex is the way to go because it's a flash kill. If you have a relatively low number of mites, then like the Apivar strips work pretty well because it's kind of a slow, long kill. I will say that the Amiflex is hard to get. You have to have a pest control license in order to get it. And so right now it's largely limited to commercial or sideline beekeepers that have a pest control license. Hopefully that changes in the near future. But right now, it's hard to get if you're a small scale beekeeper. Catherine, you said are coffee grounds okay for bees? They love it. Yeah, so if you put coffee grounds out, especially this time of year when the bees are kind of starving, are looking, we're not starving, but they're looking for anything, they will certainly go work coffee grounds. I wouldn't say that it's bad for them. I don't know that it's good for them either. But I wouldn't feed it to them, but if they're foraging on it, then that's no problem at all. Let's see. Stan, you said you have a low bee population in a hive, 2.5 to 3 frames of bees with a high pollen load and a couple frames of honey. You've been feeding with a sugar brick. You're going to break it down to a nook by putting the divider in the apame and putting a Ziploc of syrup on top. Do you need to remove the bag before it freezes in a couple of weeks? So interesting question. So yeah, so if you've got if you're doing kind of emergency feeding on a weak hive using the Ziploc bag method, do you need to remove that Ziploc bag in freezing weather so that the bag doesn't freeze? So in my experience, the Ziploc, there's usually enough heat generated from the hive that it doesn't actually freeze a Ziploc bag. And so I usually just leave it on no matter what the weather is and find that typically the heat from the bees keeps it warm enough to not cause any issues. Carmen, you said, is there any way to know if there is enough forage in your area for your bees to feed on? How many hives per square mile, et cetera? It's a really good question. So, um, like so many things in beekeeping, it depends. I mean, what the best way to tell if your bees have enough forage is looking inside your beehive. That's the best way to tell. As far as hives per square mile, et cetera, you're usually in almost any part of the country perfectly safe with 30 to 40 hives per square mile. You know, that you in almost any region, you're not going to overload the local forage, honey or pollen, with 30 to 40 hives per square mile. So that's kind of a general rule of thumb. So if you've got 3 or 4 hives in your backyard, you're never even going to come close to overloading the local forage. If you're wanting to put, 500 hives every square mile, surprisingly in the springtime, you can usually get away with, you know, 4, 5, 600 hives every square mile without overloading the natural pollen flow. Now, with that many hives, you will overload the natural nectar flow, and you will not make much of a honey crop. But you can often still be fine from a pollen flow perspective. So, rambly answer, but hopefully that helps a little bit. 30, 40 hives per square mile, no danger of nectar, honey, or pollen overload. William, good question. You said, I have bees foraging in my chicken and duck feeders. Do I need to be feeding pollen? So far, I'm in Northeast Mississippi. I have seen a smallish amount of larvae. So yeah, William, that's so common. This time of year, you do see bees foraging on chicken and duck feed, and what they're after is anything that's dusty. So if something resembles dust, which resembles pollen, chicken feed, dust, sawdust, the bees are going to be on warm days working it because there's just nothing else for them to forage on. So that's super common. As far as does that mean you need to be feeding pollen substitute? Not necessarily. I mean, no matter what, the bees are going to be foraging on that kind of thing that time of year, whether they have sufficient pollen substitute or not. When I see that going on, for the fun of it, it makes me feel better if I just put out some dry pollen substitute, and they prefer to forage on that, and it actually has some nutritional benefit. And what I do is my favorite method is to get a Pro Nook box, so those plastic Pro Nook boxes. Um, I dump a couple pounds of pollen powder in the box, put the lid on, and then remove the entrance guards on both sides of that Pro Nook box, and it's great for the bees to forage in and gather that pollen. A 5-gallon bucket laying on its side with half the lid cut off works really well too for the bees to forage on that pollen sub. Again, not necessarily critical, but it at least diverts them away from your chicken feed, and then your chickens can have the chicken feed. Jackie, what is a good plant in the spring in Texas that will be blooming later in the summer when other things are dying? Ooh, good question. So my favorite blooming plants that kind of bloom all the time in odd seasons, I love sage and vitex. So sage and vitex are great for bees, and they can bloom when the weather's a little bit hotter, and they both provide a great kind of off-season forage for bees. Alan, you said that your bees seem to be attracted to stagnant or dirty water. You assume that's because they're looking for trace minerals and nutrients. Is there any benefit or drawback to adding natural salt or minerals to the sugar water that I feed them? So you're absolutely right, Alan. Bees certainly are more attracted to dirty water, or they also love swimming pool water because it has chlorine in it. They seem to be attracted to chlorinated water as well. Um, and yeah, that theoretically they're looking for trace minerals. I'm not fully sure why they're going to it. I wouldn't add any of that to your sugar water though. Adding natural salt or trace minerals to your sugar water, I wouldn't recommend that just because the odds that you're actually pinpointing the accurate minerals that the bees might need and is slim. I would let the bees go out and forage on the pollen they're looking for, the nectar they're looking for, the propolis that they need, and rather than trying to give it to the hives. If you want to add something to the syrup, complete products. We sell complete products. We have Bee Cleanse and Complete Bee and Nosavit, or Apis Biologics. Those are all supplements that have been formed just for bees that can be added to syrup. So adding those certainly would be a good thing rather than other minerals. Someone said that you found mold on the outer lid, on the underside of your outer lid. What can you use to get rid of the gray mold? That's really common. As condensation builds up in the hive over the winter, super common to see mold build up a little bit. It doesn't really hurt the bees. Honestly, I wouldn't use anything. I would just wipe it off as best you can and go from there. I wouldn't use any sort of a cleaner or anything to remove mold. I just wipe it off and move on. And again, even if there is mold, it doesn't really bother the bees much. Craig, you said you need to move a hive about 300 yards. I'm assuming I'll have to move them to a temporary location for about a week before moving them back. How far do I need to move them from their current location? So yeah, so if you need to move a hive, 300 yards in your example, there's a couple different things you can do. Yeah, you could pick up the hive, you can move it a mile or two away. You would actually need to leave it away for a number of weeks, 3, 4 weeks, so that all the old foragers kind of die off. And then you move the hive back to its new location, and the new foragers and new bees, will reorient to that new location. That's a real pain. It really is. If it were me, I would go out there on a cool day and I'd just move them. Go out there on a cold day or at night, and just move them 300 yards. You might have a 5% forager loss that goes back to the old location, if that. Oftentimes, at a distance of 300 yards, the bees are going to kind of reorient anyway. Putting something in front of the hive, like a branch or a bush or a tire, I don't know, something big and visible in front of the hive, to kind of block their entrance a little bit, will kind of force them to reorient, and that can help cut down on the loss when you move them 300 yards. You could also put an empty box with a couple frames of comb in it in the old location, and then let it sit for a day, and then if there are a bunch of foragers on those frames, shake them back off in front of your old hive. But 9 times out of 10, if I'm moving them, that far, 300 yards, I find that they tend to just reorient on their own, and you have very, very minimal loss. It's almost more problematic to move them like 50 feet. That's where I tend to see a little more of an issue, but 300 yards, I just move them. Okay, a couple more questions before we wrap it up for the evening. Paul asked, when would you stop feeding dry pollen, or when would you stop feeding sugar bricks? The bees are going to stop taking the dry pollen once there's a natural pollen flow. So when the natural pollen flow kicks in, the bees are not going to consume dry pollen anymore. So that would be a normal place to stop. The sugar bricks, I would just say, once daytime temperatures are consistently in the 60s, the bees are going to start drinking liquid syrup. That's when you could stop feeding the sugar bricks. If your hive just needs a little bit of food, you can keep feeding sugar bricks. I mean, there's certainly nothing wrong with continuing to feed throughout the year as needed. But you can switch to liquid feed once daytime temperatures are consistently in the 60s. Sue, you said you're in Colorado and you had a warm week after a cold spell, temperatures in the 50s and 60s. Today you saw bees with black pollen baskets. We have nothing blooming yet, and the first pollen is usually silver maple, which is in February. What could the black bee that they're collecting. That is so interesting. So the black could be, well, to be honest, Sue, I have no idea. I've got some guesses. Like the chicken feed and the sawdust, bees gather weird things when there is nothing natural coming in. So I have seen bees forage on ash. It could like a charred tree. I've seen them forage on that ash because it's kind of dusty and powdery. So that would be my best guess. It could be that something's blooming that has black pollen that's really rare, maybe at some elevation somewhere. Uh, Ash would probably be my first guess, though, or a charred tree. Uh, Dawn, you asked, you treated today with oxalic acid vapor. Um, as a preseason preventative. You didn't have a high mite count in October when you last checked. Should I treat again in a week? I don't see any brood. So yeah, if I'm doing an oxalic acid vapor treatment this time of year with no brood present, yeah, I would probably do two treatments, and there's a pretty much a guarantee you're going to wipe out all the Varroa mites because when you use any mite treatment when there's no brood present, it's incredibly, incredibly effective. So yeah, I would do two oxalic acid vapor treatments, and it will probably do an awesome job at getting rid of all your Varroa mites. Okay, last question from Robin. Do you really have to feed the bees? Your hives are super busy on warm, sunny days. You're out in central Pennsylvania. So just because, unfortunately, just because the bees are active doesn't mean that they are bringing in nectar. Bees can be super active. They can even be bringing in a lot of pollen, but that doesn't mean they're bringing in nectar, which is what they need to rear brood. They need carbs and protein, which is nectar or syrup and pollen. So don't rely on activity to let you know that your bees don't need food. Now, go out there and lift up on your hive or lift up on the boxes. If your hive is nice and heavy, no, you don't need to feed. But if they're really light, then you do need to feed, even if there's activity. Sometimes when that activity starts peaking, it's a sign we do need to feed because it means that the bees are burning energy. They're probably starting to rear brood, which means that they are consuming more food. And if there's not enough natural nectar coming in, that's when we have to step in as beekeepers and say, hey, we better do some feeding so that they have the resources that they need. So great questions, everybody. I'd love one day we should do a webinar of just Q&A. That'd probably be a great one for like April when everybody has a bazillion questions. But thank you for those awesome questions. If you have any more, feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll hang out and keep answering those. But yeah, I mean, next month is March. March and April are the busiest months in the whole beekeeping year. So definitely tune in. We're going to talk about splitting and swarming and feeding and adding boxes. Everything goes crazy in March and April. So definitely join us for that. And until then, stay warm. And I will see you all in March. Have a great evening, everybody.